At a time when bulk transport was by rail, then horse and cart, the simplest way of keeping these enormous estates and their large staff fed was to grow it yourself. And so most big houses had walled gardens and skilled gardeners that fed all their needs all year round, such as these gardens at Belvedere House.
I think at one stage there were 20 people working in the gardens. And his gardens, from the mid-19th century, his cousin Charles Brinsley Marley had set out the gardens as we see them there now with the walled garden. So that needed a lot of care and attention.
My dad was actually about 16, I'd imagine, when he started in the garden in Gaeltacht. There was a guy called, what was his name? Buchanan, George Buchanan, I think. He was probably an Englishman. He would have been the gardener there. It was everything was very well kept there. It was about a 6-acre garden they had beautiful glass houses, greenhouses and everything, and they grew on their own vegetables.
Middleton was a factory, we'll say, as such. Like, every local in the place got work in Middleton. You know, out on the farm, they'd get temporary work, we'll say, what's the equivalent of social welfare now. Like.
They seemed to be quite happy working there. My father was very interested in learning the trades of grafting trees and doing that. And afterwards in life, we did run a market garden in my home in Ballymurray for quite a few summers.
So I went on to Darramona and working at the tomatoes. Now that was a very tricky thing for me to start in because I hadn't been used to gardening or anything like that. But we were very soon shown what to do and what not to do. And there was all kinds of fruit trees and fruit bushes in the garden, and if you wanted to, you could have fruit 3 times a day. You know, they had, which was unusual that time. I remember the head man, Mr. Daly. He was lovely. He was a gentleman, every inch of him. We planted lettuce in the greenhouses, thousands of heads of lettuce, which had to be looked after. And when they were fit to sell, you had to be in at 6 in the morning to get them into their baskets. And I think it was 12 heads to a basket. A chip, they used to call a little basket.
Middleton was a big house, and it was a huge garden, and there was a wall that must have been the height of the ceiling here, all around it. And there was 3 gardeners, I think, 2, 3 anyway. But under no circumstance were we allowed to go near that, and if you did, that was it. You were finished.
Port Lomond House, north of Mullingar, which is gone now, but Port Lomond House, the walled gardens there grew vegetables, and not only did they feed the household, including visiting VIPs, but they also actually supplied Dublin Castle with some of the vegetables for the state dinners and that. So yes, they were quite self-sufficient.
Mrs. Purden came down every morning at a specified time, sat at the end of the kitchen table with a pen and a piece of paper, and told my mother what was happening for the day. So the captain's going to Dublin, he won't be here for lunch. The girls will be here, but I won't be here, I'm going such a place. We'll have a cold supper in the drawing room, whatever way around she wanted food. And first person in the morning was the vegetable man, the man that worked in the garden, and he would come in with a range of what was fresh. But he'd only bring one of everything, he wouldn't just presume. And my mother would look at and turn it inside out, and she'd say, I want those and those. Yeah, no, don't bring me those, they're not ready. And he would go away and then he'd bring in what she asked.
Even most houses were terribly self-sufficient, and that would have knocked on, because I noticed there were a family who worked here, and they always had super gardens, good vegetable gardens, because they used to keep the garden, but they would have come from a tradition apart from working from here and doing the garden. They would have come from a tradition. Everybody, if they had a bit of a garden, it wasn't decorative, it was potatoes, vegetables and a bit of fruit perhaps.
Living in service, one of the things about living in service was that you had a free house. You had 3 drills of spuds a year, which would feed our family. You had 2 loads or 3 loads of timber, which meant that was fuel for the year.
We had a cow, and the cow was milked, and she kept us in milk, and the butter was, the milk was skimmed, and the cream was put into a churn, and my mother churned the butter once a week.
So we're just going to put the cream in now. Four litres gone in now, into 4 litres of cream. Now, so we're just putting the lid back on it. So we turn and turn and turn and turn for a long, long time, for at least a half an hour anyway.
She'd be like this, and when you'd go in, or even if a stranger came in, they had to...
You had to take over to that.
Just throw their weight on it, and it was lovely butter that time.
Keep going and going and going until it changes sound. I can still remember the sound. And then when Mommy, this is changing sound, and you didn't want to be lifting the lid too often because let the air in it. I don't know why, but that was the reason. And then when you know there was plenty of it in it, you'd hear it slapping, like it'd be staying together. And then it'd be taken out.
And then you had your 2 patios, and you had your butter, the board, and you had to take it out, and you had the best get all the water and the milk.
I loved the fresh buttermilk. I used to get a mug, and I'd let the turn on the tap, and I'd fill my mug with buttermilk, and I'd sit down, and I'd say, well, you're entitled to this, kiddo. Sit down and have my mug of buttermilk. Be lovely, lovely.
When my mother, if there was anything extra to be paid for, she would rear chickens, and then we'd head off to Mullingar, and it was 6 miles.
Her and 2 other women used to set off on a Thursday with their eggs and their butter behind their bikes, and they'd go to Mullingar and sell it off the street. I can remember standing on the street, and the butter, she'd have the butter down on the, on something on the pavement.
The only thing they do, they hadn't to run more. There was no more cars. There was no going shopping, no big stores, or no nothing going on at the time. But all survived.
That seemingly happy world of the big house, notwithstanding their issues with finance and rising wages, were now facing 2 enormous forces of change. Ireland was facing growing threats of a civil war between Carson and the Unionists in the north, and the South's home rule and the creation of their own volunteer force.
The circumstances of the people in the big houses had changed dramatically. They were afraid of a civil war in Ireland, with the Unionists looking for to stay as part of Britain, and the Unionists down here felt abandoned, really, that they were, when the border was come in there, that they were abandoned by Britain, that they weren't wanted by them and they weren't wanted down here. So they didn't know what, they were caught in a perfect storm, really.
But strangely, the other great threat would put all that on hold, as the headlines screamed out the tsunami that was coming, the First World War. This war would touch most big houses as well as their staff, and would change that relationship forever.
My mother's father was killed in the First World War in 1918, and he was a Russell from Mount Temple in County Westmeath.
Have you a butler, groom, chauffeur, gardener or gamekeeper serving you at this moment who should be serving your king and country?
And of course, in the First World War in Westmeath as elsewhere, an awful lot of the heirs to the big houses went to war and they didn't come back, and that devastated quite a lot of the families here. Edward Longford became Earl of Longford. He inherited the house and the earldom when he was only, I think, 12 years of age when his father was killed.
On our mother's side, the Smiths of Gaeltacht, Captain Smith, he was in the war, but then he had a brother who was killed, and then her grandmother had an elder brother who was also a cousin. He had a younger brother, he was killed in the war.
Have you a man preserving your game who should be helping to preserve your country?
One story my father used to tell about, there was a few lads working in Middleton, and the captain's wife wasn't impressed with some of the lads that were there, and she says to them, you should be out to stop the Germans. And there was 3 or 4 of them anyway, they weren't overly impressed, and they said no, they weren't going to risk their neck to keep the Germans out. She said, the Germans will be in Dublin shortly. And this lad says, I don't give an F if they're at Joe Carey's at the station. I'm not joining up. And that's
were they under pressure to join up? Maybe in 1 or 2 cases they were, but I think in some cases they felt it was something they would, maybe particularly if their employer's son was going off to fight, and they might felt, well, he's going, we should go too. But I don't think there was any case where they were said, if you don't join up, I'll fire you, things. They were all, I think in some cases they just went as well.
I mean, all the other big houses in inverted commas, like Nares Court, Middleton, Colonel Winter, Colonel Boyd Rochford, Colonel Pardon, Colonel Harvey Kelly. I mean, they'd all had the same.
Wartime experience.
For the men from Westmeath coming back from the war, now faced the next big threat, the Spanish flu, the world's greatest killer pandemic, which would kill over 20 million people worldwide. But a pandemic that would seem, for some strange reason, to have left rural Westmeath and the big houses relatively untouched. But as the World War I veterans were returning, so were the jailed Irish volunteers from the 1916 uprising. And in part 3, we will look at the last of the great upheavals in the world of the big house, as Ireland embarked on a war for independence and a subsequent divisive civil war.